Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan Milner and this is Total Performance, a podcast dedicated to all things athletic performance and injury prevention. Join me and my guests as we explore the many aspects that come together to build our total performance picture. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, my guest today is Elisabeth Oehler. Elisabeth is a weightlifting and strength and conditioning coach, currently working as the head of strength and conditioning in a multi-sports academy in Saudi Arabia, focusing on martial arts, handball, and athletics. Elisabeth has a background in sports science and also holds an MSc in sport coaching from the University of Birmingham. She's currently pursuing her professional doctorate in elite sports performance at Dublin City University. One of the reasons I was really interested in speaking to Elisabeth today is because of her background in Olympic weightlifting. From 2017 through the end of 2020, she worked as a full-time coach for the German Weightlifting Federation, first as a manager of the youth department and later as head of talent identification and a national coach. Elisabeth has a wealth of knowledge regarding not only Olympic weightlifting, but also long-term athlete development and coaching for children. So today's episode is kind of split into two parts. In the beginning, we're talking a little bit more about Olympic lifting technique and how that might be variable according to your body type, and also how you might be able to self-correct your Olympic lifting technique if you don't have constant access to a coach. So this is really helpful for some of you who have been training for a while and want to either begin Olympic lifting as part of your strength program, or those of you who've been working on Olympic lifting for a little while and want to hear more about how some aspects of technique might be a little bit variable. But in the second part of the podcast, Elisabeth and I particularly talk about Olympic weightlifting for children. We talk about why Elisabeth believes in teaching Olympic weightlifting to children, how teaching Olympic lifts to children is different from teaching Olympic lifts to adults, and also what Elisabeth thinks is most important for parents and coaches to focus on to set up their children for better physical literacy later in life. As usual, we cover a lot of topics, but I think you're going to enjoy it. Welcome, Elisabeth. How are you doing?
Hi, thanks for the invitation. I'm doing all right.
I'm super excited that you're joining. I've followed you on social media for a long time, so it's really nice to actually be able to talk to you live.
Yeah, it's quite nice to meet people finally, like even though we're still on Zoom now, but it's quite nice to follow people or to meet up with people now besides social media or I'm mainly active on Twitter, so it's very nice to do this podcast with you.
The thing that I'm finding at the moment actually with meeting people on Zoom, especially the last couple of years, is that I kind of forget that I've only met people virtually once I've seen someone's face and have talked to them. And then when I might eventually meet them at a conference, I'm like, oh wait, we actually haven't seen each other in real life before, and then it kind of clicks.
No, I had the same, and I actually had like through COVID. I think a lot of us built like friendships to people that you just met virtually and never like really in person. That's maybe one positive aspect of COVID.
So I wanted to talk to you today about Olympic weightlifting in particular. So I'm curious as to what drew you to Olympic weightlifting in the beginning and how you got started in it.
So I've always been someone who was very invested in the Olympics. Even as a kid, I grew up watching the Olympics, even when I was still in elementary school. And I still remember that when in 2000 the Olympics in Sydney, that I was like sneaking out of, because of time difference for Germany to Sydney, I was sneaking out of my bed and watching every competition that I could. And 2000 was the first time women's weightlifting was an Olympic sport. So before that, it was only for men, and 2000 was basically the first time women were able to compete in Olympic weightlifting. I remember watching, and at that time, or in the year 2000, I was 9 years old. I remember watching it, and I thought that was so cool, but it was never really a sport like that I really got into as a kid. So because especially not as a girl, and there was nothing really happening for girls in that sport. I only found weightlifting then later again, like when I started studying when I was 18, 19. I tried to find something to do, joined a weightlifting club, and I kind of got very obsessed with it. Yeah, then I competed later on national level, and then I never really made it, and then I became a coach. I really liked coaching the Olympic lifts. I'm a very like analytical person, I would say. I really like how simple but how difficult Olympic weightlifting is. Yeah, that's how I got into it and why I like it.
I'm curious because of your specific background in Olympic weightlifting, because I know you're working as a sports performance coach as well. You're not just teaching weightlifting. In my own experience, when we're going through like S&C style courses, really directed just for S&C coaches, the Olympic lifts sometimes even get taught slightly differently or have a slightly different focus than they would if you went to an actual Olympic lifting course. So I'm wondering if you feel that you look at, and this is kind of a either or and both question, if you look at programming weightlifting differently to perhaps a traditional S&C coach would, and perhaps if you look at the technique elements differently.
So I always say when people ask me like how much influence my weightlifting or Olympic weightlifting background has on me being an S&C coach, I would say it's actually two different coaching philosophies, or it's even two different coaching identities, I would say. Because when I was coaching, or when sometimes I still coach Olympic weightlifting, I'm a sports coach. I'm not an S&C coach in that moment. So I'm a sports coach. So I have not my responsibilities are not just the physical preparation of the athlete, like in an S&C or sports performance role. It's like the performance or the physical aspect, mainly the physical aspect. When I'm coaching weightlifting, I have the technical side. I think that's obvious. I have the physical side, but I'm also responsible for the mental side. So I'm more a holistic coach. Like I'm a sports coach when I coach the Olympic lift. Obviously from all these different aspects, it is very different how I act as a weightlifting coach than how I act as a S&C coach. When I program some Olympic lifts, I don't even use all of them because weightlifting is an Olympic sport for a reason. When I program Olympic lifts for example for a rugby player or a football player, in the US we say soccer, then it's obviously with a complete different intention than when I plan it obviously for a weightlifter. And even the technical aspects and the technical detail is much different. So for example, when we are in Olympic weightlifting, we're looking for max lift. So I'm way more focused on really the tiniest technical detail in order to get better. In sports performance or in S&C, very often I'm just chasing adaptations. Then I don't, certain technical aspects that are very important for a weightlifter are not that important, for example, for a rugby player or a football player or a sprinter. It's way more detailed and way more focused in weightlifting. In sports or in S&C education, it's not really that helpful to go with technical models that we use in weightlifting and just apply it in a sports performance setting. As I said, it's like the majority of technical models in weightlifting are for specific body types, and we don't have these body types in other sports. For example, the technical model that I learned at German weightlifting, for example, that would never be applicable for a basketball player, because all our athletes are rather short. They have like very long upper bodies, short arms, short legs. You don't really have that with football or basketball players. So these technical models and these things that I look for in a weightlifter, they are not really applicable in sports performance. But there are a lot of principles that you can apply in sports performance. And I think if you want to really teach the Olympic lifts properly, you should find like a hybrid course where someone who has worked as a weightlifting coach, but also as an S&C coach, who kind of understands how it's applicable. My experience with weightlifting federations offering sports performance or Olympic lifts for sports performance coaches are not really that good, because they most of the time they don't understand sports performance. And I think it's better to have like someone who has done both and understands both.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, the basketball example, because I don't work with basketballers, but I work with Dutch athletes, and so many of them are so tall, and so there's often a lot of things that we've got to adjust just because of their height. But I'm curious then, one of the things that we sometimes see in the literature is about fixed components or these variable components of Olympic lifts. So I wonder if, even for just one example, if you could kind of describe what this means, and maybe whether or not actually these fixed components are all that fixed. Does it vary between body types? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so for example, I know that there are certain technical models. For example, let's take the snatch or the clean, doesn't really matter. Let's take the snatch, so we stick with one. There are certain technical models, and if you look in rather to Asia, but also they kind of teach it in the US as well, a bit like this. They have a starting position with a rather lower hips and the shoulder over the bar. I personally found that this is not really suitable or doable for the majority of athletes that I have in other sports, because of how long their legs are. So what I tried to do is what I changed, and what we have also changed a bit in the German weightlifting technical model was, okay, we don't want to have the shoulder over the bar. We will actually want to have it in front of the bar. And we have the hips are in a higher position in the starting position. And very often I see that very often when lifts are getting taught to other athletes, they say, oh, you need to lower your hips, or you need to pull more out of your, whatever that means, like with your legs. But I actually think that the most body types that we deal with in team sports or track and field or other sports, they are not able to have this deep hip position with the shoulder over the bar. So they rather shift a bit forward, have the shoulder in front of the bar, and then the hips a bit higher. Some things that I think basically remain the same are, I want to have like the barbell in the snatch, for example, I want to have body contact in the upper third of the thigh. So that's what I'm aiming for. So if you put 3 parts on your thigh, in the upper third, this is where the barbell touches the body for the first time in the pull. When I look at the clean, I always say it's in the lower third of the thigh. Then that's something that's quite optimal. And then triple extension remains the same. And then we have obviously where we have a huge difference is in the catching position, because weightlifters obviously are able to catch in an extremely deep squat position. Majority of other athletes not able to do that. And this is why the whole catching position is completely different between weightlifters and other athletes. And also in combination with that, if you catch deeper, you don't need to pull that high. And you also don't need to pull that much, actually. So we are aiming for a higher Vmax as weightlifters, but it's not as high as possible. When I'm looking at sports performance, I want to have a high Vmax because I'm chasing an adaptation. When I look at the weightlifters, I want to have an optimal or a good Vmax, so that they can pull under the bar, not, for example, if they pull too much or too high, and then they go into a deep squat position, and usually the barbell crashes down on them. I don't want that. So I'm not looking for as high as, or for a Vmax as high as possible. I rather look for an optimal one.
One of the things I'm wondering, because the athletes that work with you and the athletes that have funding and are at certain levels in clubs, they usually have someone who's working with them and has an eye on them during these sorts of Olympic lifts and their derivatives. But of course, throughout sport, there's different levels of funding, different levels of resources. I wonder if you have any tips for athletes who might be working with Olympic lifts or their derivatives, but might not have that same coaching resource all the time, on ways that they can either self-correct or improve technique, because I find that these are some of the lifts as well that certain people don't feel comfortable working on by themselves? Or would you just say, you know what, you really need to go and find a really good coach for this?
So I think obviously if you're a good mover, so there's this one thing. If you're a good mover, and you have like a lot of body awareness, and you don't have mobility issues, and you're just you're athletic, I think you're able to teach the Olympic lifts to yourself, like on your own. And I think you can really achieve a lot by watching videos, recording yourself, and then comparing you to other. There are great resources out there. English speaking, for example, Greg Everett does a lot of free, or has a lot of free content for weightlifters. I think it's possible to train on your own if you are a good athlete, or if you are athletic. When you're not like this, or when you come from a sport, usually a team sport like football or basketball, usually you are athletic, obviously, but it's something completely, the Olympic lifts are something completely different. So for example, I found it was always very easy for gymnasts to learn the Olympic lifts, super easy, or figure skaters, or every very high technical sports. All these athletes always had no issue learning them. But with team sports, for example, I always found it super hard to teach them the Olympic lifts. When you are rather on that side, then I would invest rather into a coach, at least in the beginning. And then there's a lot of technology. It's not particularly cheap, but I think in the long run, it's cheap. It's at least cheaper than having constantly a coach. I would invest into a tracking device, for example, BMX Pro, or there's Output Sports as well. Or there are a lot of, I don't want to make any ads here, but there are a lot of different sensors or video capturing apps that you can use for yourself and to evaluate yourself, and just find a way, maybe every now and then, to discuss what you've done in your videos and your analysis with a coach. I've personally done that a couple of times with athletes that worked on their own, so they had their own lifting program, and also used the VMAX Pro, for example, and recorded everything. And then every 2-3 months we did like an update call, and then they booked an hour, and we went through the videos, and I said, okay, this is what in the next block you can work on this and this and this technical aspect. If you analyze it through the software that you have, or if you analyze it with that technology that you have, then look for this and this and this aspect of the lift. So this is a cheaper, in my opinion, a cheaper version than going to a coach all the time. And I think if you are very disciplined, and if you are able to do that in your setting, then that's quite helpful.
You've taught weightlifting to a variety of ages, and I know you're also teaching other coaches how to teach weightlifting, especially to children as well. So when you're teaching these lifts or the derivatives to younger versus older athletes, do you approach this differently? And I'm curious as well, especially if there are athletes that are coming to Olympic lifting and their derivatives later in life, are there certain things that you might shy away from, or just different ways you might teach them? Or would you focus on something else for them if you're chasing adaptation?
So I think I'm pretty outspoken about me preferring to teach the Olympic lifts before puberty, or as early as possible. I usually have kids, or I usually teach the Olympic lifts to kids. I think it's also a bit because of my background. I mean, Olympic weightlifting is a sport, so it's an Olympic sport where kids start pretty early if they want to succeed in that sport. That's not a sport where you just start at a later age, even though some people think they can still make it, even though they just started at the age of 20. But I don't think that's realistic. If you look like internationally, what level you need to have at a very early age, you have to start early, and it is technically very, very difficult. And also building the strength takes such a long time. So because of this and basically being in the sport, I prefer teaching it to young kids because they can learn it. They learn it pretty quickly. There are many issues that you find at a later stage, like mobility or in general physical literacy. If, for example, if you have kids that haven't moved for 2 or 3 years and in a certain development stage, then you can really feel how that affected their physical literacy. Something that I find particularly interesting now with COVID, because the kids that I get now, they have a complete different motor skill level than the kids that I used to have before COVID. So I prefer teaching it to at a very young age. And also my teaching progressions are much different. Something that, or some of the main differences is with youth athletes or young athletes, I spend a lot of time with positions, and especially starting position. I teach the Olympic lifts into a deep squat from the beginning. So, for example, we never do a power. I've never done a power snatch, power clean, or anything with a kid. I teach them, like, I break down the clean into the different phases, and then I teach it from there. When I'm working with older athletes, then usually usually I skip. They usually don't clean or snatch into a deep squat. So we rather do a power position, and also the whole teaching progression then changes. Also, something that I found particularly interesting with the difference between adults and or older athletes and younger athletes is how kids they don't really understand if you have different exercises that you progress. For example, you progress over certain exercises and teach them first a push press, and then a push jerk, and then a split jerk. Kids never understand the connection. I never found that kids understand the connection. So I rather said, okay, from the beginning, we just teach them a split jerk. So I just leave this whole push press, push jerk out, because they don't understand the connection between that. The same with like a power clean for a kid is something completely different than a clean into the deep squat. So I teach them the clean into a deep squat from the beginning, and don't go that route of a power clean. And then obviously I was very lucky, and that's something I thought about a lot in the last year. I was always very lucky to have very talented kids. I don't think I haven't worked much with kids that had, for example, mobility problems or had a very low level of physical literacy. So usually when I taught Olympic lifts, I always had quite talented or quite skilled kids, I would say. So which makes it a lot different than with older athletes. And kids they don't overthink. They just go on. When you tell them to go under, like to pull themselves under the bar, they just do it. They are not scared. So with older athletes, you usually have that. They are super scared with their arms, and then they do a press out. And kids I always say, like, they just pull themselves under it with no fear, which makes it a lot easier. And I never had this issue with being scared to go under a snatch or to pull yourself under a heavy snatch or something. So for me, with older athletes, it's kind of like difficult to understand why they feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah, with kids, it's like they're not scared unless you tell them to be scared.
yeah. Like when I remember the first time we did like with the kids snatches from the hang, like there was not a single kid who, like, they look at the demonstration and they just do it, or they just imitate it, and then they don't think about it. And when you are with older athletes, and they usually, oh, I don't know, like, this is so heavy, and then they overthinking it, and then they usually have a press out or something else happens. And with kids, they just do it, which is quite nice actually to work with such kids.
One of the things that you mentioned is that you're seeing kind of potentially a decline in physical literacy, but also maybe sometimes some of these older athletes coming to you aren't necessarily physically literate. So is there something that you would recommend to coaches or parents to kind of focus on when these athletes are younger, or different methods to improve this?
Probably what is most important, and I know it always sounds like a mantra when I say that, but like kids just need to play a lot and a lot in unstructured environments. But there's not also nothing bad about structured environments. So I'm not like one of these people like, okay, we're gonna do now a training session and we just let them figure out everything on their own. Like there can be some sort of structure. I think also from a organized sports perspective, we can't do as much as we would like to. So we have to kind of introduce sports specific skills at a certain age, even though we know and kind of know that their fundamental skills are not really that good, or we have like deficits in other areas like strength or speed or power, but we still have to kind of teach them already sports specific skills. But I think, or the advice I would give to parents is let kids like play a lot outside, even if it's just inside, and let them play let them play certain kind of sports. Like I try to have a big diversity of sport. I should experience a big diversity of sports, but it doesn't have to be competitive. I think you can't do much wrong if you let your kids go to one of the fighting sports. Usually something I've experienced in a lot of different countries actually, and in general, wrestling or judo or even taekwondo, these coaches usually have a very, very well balanced sports program. So a lot of those, especially wrestling, I don't know, I've seen it now in 4 different countries, or wrestling programs, 4 different countries. Wrestling coaches, they usually know they need a lot of different fundamental movement skills and they have to develop it. Running, skipping, galloping, rolling, pulling, climbing. Usually these kind of sports, they cover a lot of fundamental movement skills, much more than, for example, team sports do. But this is like now just my really personal and subjective opinion. I think it's quite helpful to be in a sport where there's awareness for, first of all, fundamental movement skills, the importance of it, where you have a variety of fundamental movement skills, and where you have some sort of decision-making component as well. The majority of team sports programs, unfortunately, focus on a certain very limited number of fundamental movement skills, even in the early ages. So I don't think I've ever seen a youth football, like youth soccer program that did like rolling or climbing or these kind of things. And the individual sports, however, you quite often have that.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting, particularly about the kind of the fighting sports.
Yeah.
I know nothing about wrestling, but I'm wondering, because there are some sports where it's like there's multiple avenues to success, and other sports where in general it's the same technique that gets you towards success. I wonder, is wrestling a bit more freeform? Is that why they're preferencing a lot of these movements?
So, and this is just opinion, and I have no study to back that up. That's just my personal impression of working in youth sports. I feel when you look at the especially at the team sports models that we have, like the youth sports models, so you can get quite successful in soccer, like football, when you play already at an early age, when you play already systems and structures, when you really teach kids to do certain, or when you do certain drills, and when you really already prepare them tactically for the opponent. You always play the same teams, and you always know exactly which kids there are, how they're going to play, who the coach is. So there's not really a lot of space, or there's not really the demand or the need to improve creativity, improve decision making, because you can be quite successful on youth level with like playing structures and systems. You don't particularly have that in the fighting sports, because you most of the time you have so many different, you have one opponent. Everything is very unpredictable. You don't really know how they are, what they do. Then in the fighting sports, you need a lot of body awareness, you need a lot of coordination, and I think a lot of those coaches have kind of figured out that you can only develop that by having a huge variation in your training design on youth level, and not just teaching them techniques. And there will probably also be a lot of coaches in the fighting sports that just teach techniques, but techniques itself will not really make you win fights. But playing systems and structures in football will make you win maybe the league. It's something that I think in the individual sports is like a bit different. So there's a bigger need of teaching them a bigger variety, having more decision-making components, etc. in the training design. What is quite a good and this is like now an example from Germany in football, like soccer. So they kind of figured out that a lot of it on youth level, especially with children, that a lot of coaches play the same teams throughout several age groups, and there's not really much creativity in the way they play and the playing style. What they changed the youth sports model for under 10s and under 10 and I'm not quite sure if under 12 is still in it, but I'm 100% sure it's under 10 and below. They get away from leagues, so they don't play leagues anymore. And if you are part of a football club and you want to play games, you play short, small-sided games in more like a festival or a weekend tournament. And all teams have to rotate, so you're not in your team, but you have to rotate between other teams that are on the festival as well. So basically what they're trying to do is now, well, we send players to this festival and we give them different teammates for every game they play. So the score doesn't really count. There will be no winner at the end, which is fine. But they have to adapt every game they play to different teammates, basically. So we have a bigger, like that requires the kids to make more decisions, to adapt to these new environments. And you, as a coach, you don't get away with like teaching them, okay, we play this system now. So which is, I think this is gonna improve team sports a bit. This is just an example on how to improve this decision-making component. And then also I think coaches will always do what are the game demands, even in the younger age groups. A lot of coaches don't really have that development mindset, but they really want to win their little league that they play or win their local competition or whatever. If you change the competition format and then you basically force coaches to adapt to these different game demands. And now it's not really helpful at under 10 level now in football, it's not really helpful for the under 10 coach to teach them any tactical stuff because the other kids will not know it. So they're really trying to have more ball touches and like playing more freely, more creative, and because the new game format requires it. So this is quite something where we can improve in youth sports.
Yeah, and then it's really play.
Yeah, and that's how kids should play. I don't think you need to teach kids any tactics when they are like 8-9 years old. Just let them play with the ball and figure things out themselves. There's still so much time where you can teach them tactics, so focus on skill development and decision making in these age groups.
Okay, of course there's always parents who, like some of these coaches, just want the kids to win. But I feel like play is something, and the idea of overall physical development is something that a lot of parents can easily get behind.
Yeah.
But one thing that I feel like some parents are still quite scared of is resistance training or weightlifting for younger athletes. And I wonder if I feel like this probably kind of has to be a soundbite in a way, but is there something that you usually communicate to coaches or parents who are worried about that?
I'm doing this now for 5 years full time, and I'm at a point where I'm like, I'm almost annoyed of parents or other coaches that still follow those old these old views or these old opinions. We know that, and then I sometimes think like there are studies where they found or where they actually try to explain the benefits of resistance training for kids even before 20 or 25 years ago. these issues a lot of parents or other sports coaches have been debunked like already 20 years ago. So it kind of at some point it gets a bit annoying, but it's my job as a youth coach or someone who coaches a lot of different age groups. It's kind of my job to educate parents, even though it's like saying the same old thing again. I did a presentation for parents like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, I can't do this presentation in my sleep. I can wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning. I will be able to do this presentation about resistance training with kids for parents. I think I always try to explain studies and findings to them. And I usually also try to explain a bit around what athletic development is. I shy away a bit from the term strength training, even though I have a course that's called strength training for kids, but I shy away a bit of you saying that it's strength training, but rather like it's athletic development. And I try to explain also a few things that happen developmentally when kids grow and mature, so parents understand a bit better what is actually going on. Because something that I figured out is a lot of pressure in sports from parents, and a lot of like fears and or other emotions simply arise because a lot of parents don't really know how kids actually develop and grow and mature. One of the biggest misconceptions is the growth plate or weight training stunting a child's growth. So I usually explain what a growth plate even is, because the majority of people don't really know what it is. And even if you ask some S&Cs what the growth plate is and what it actually does, and what a growth plate fracture is, because growth plate fractures happen, actually they happen, and they happen not quite often, but they happen. And even a growth plate fracture doesn't mean that the kid is not going to grow. I try to explain those developmental changes. The same with something that I think is important, where we need to do a lot more education for parents, is around, okay, what effects actually puberty, PHB, what effects that has on physical qualities. And even sports coaches, even sports coaches don't really know a lot. It's always, for me, it's always interesting to see, or I've often got asked, can we please do testing with the under 14s or under 15s? So basically with under 14s, you have like 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, and then they want to do speed testing. And I was like, do you know that in this age group, and when they're 13, 14, like they're most likely, a lot of them will be around just before around peak height velocity. So if you do speed testing now and you do it probably in 2 weeks, again, you have such a variance or such differences between the numbers. Are you aware of that? Like, are you aware that that speed testing in certain age groups have like just an extreme variance around PHV? And even a lot of like sports coaches are not educated about that. And then I never want to do selection or talent identification based on data that are not put into a context of development, growth, and maturation. And this is something I think we need to do a lot more education about, because especially in football, football is a really good example. How often, like, I hear from football coaches or even parents, oh, you all of a sudden got so slow, or all of a sudden he doesn't have he's not that fast anymore in the field, and he's so uncoordinated. And I'm like, well, that's normal. He's growing. You just wait a bit. You don't need to make a decision now, or it is normal that he's a bit uncoordinated right now, or that he's not that fast anymore. Probably his arms and his legs have grown a lot, and the body doesn't really cope with it very well. You need to give them time and to adjust to the new bodies. You can't expect like progress throughout a time where a lot of the body changes so much. And that's something where I think we have a huge lack of education in sports in general. And that's something I think we should put more focus on, because I've experienced a couple of times that even parents put pressure on their kids, said, why are you so slow all of a sudden? You're not working hard enough. You have to work harder. You got like, yeah, especially the thing with, yeah, you don't have the skills anymore. You need to work more. And then the kid is dealing with growth spurt, and then it gets from the parents, it gets told from the parents or the coach, he got slower and needs to work harder. And then basically on the growing body, they put more volume, because that's usually what happens. And then it's just a huge mess up. And it's simply because coaches and parents have no clue what is happening with their child during puberty. That's something I think where we need to do a lot more work as SSC coaches, or sports performance coaches in general.
Yeah, I've had it with certain athletes during their growth spurts. Like I remember one athlete in particular who it's like there was one phase where he just lost all perception of where his body was. Like the body awareness changes entirely. And it's like, oh, really? My back's doing this. Oh, really? My arm's out here. And it's pretty crazy to see that transition sometimes.
Yeah, I had it in weightlifting. I had that once. There was a 4 week summer break, which is like, not 4 weeks is not that long, but I had a kid coming back after 4 weeks, and I think grew like this, and we had to adjust like for the snatch and the clean. We had to completely start over with like how wide the grip should be,
Yeah.
stance, everything. And then I was like, actually, I'm not sure if that's a good idea to adjust it now. Just like let him play some other sports. We're gonna adjust it maybe in like a month or two, because he might still grow a bit more. Yeah, it's what growth and maturation does is crazy, and what impact it has on skill.
So I feel like we've gone all sorts of tangents in our discussion today, but I wonder if there's anything that you would want listeners to take away from this, if there's anything you'd want to share in particular.
Yeah, I think the last point that I made, that was actually a good statement for to finish. We need to do more first of all, educate ourselves, and this also includes like, it took me a lot of time to educate myself about these topics as well, because it's also not, you don't learn that in any SSC coaching course, and also in the most majority of youth sports coaching courses, you also don't learn that. So first of all, never stop learning about what is going on with your athletes, so about growth, maturation, etc. I think that's, even if you're working with youth athletes, it's even more important than knowing every training method and what adaptations you get out of it. It's actually more important to know what is going on in the body of your athletes. The second thing is something that I wanted to say for quite a while. Coaching kids is not really something like that is appreciated a lot. A lot of people think it's cool, it's so important, but not a lot of people actually want to do it. And we have this issue, especially when it comes to resistance training with kids. Everyone always thinks, oh, that's so cool, and look at this kid. Whenever I share a video of one of my younger kids lifting, I always get a lot of social media traction. But there are very little there's a very little number of SLC coaches or sports performance coaches in general that actually want to put in the work and coaching kids. And it's difficult to make it a business model. Like, I've experienced it myself. It might be because of the country I live in, but like, I never earned any money with coaching kids, but I always found it very, very valuable for me as a coach. And also, if you want to change something in the sports system, coaching kids in the right way, in a good way, and with a developmental mindset, I think you can really make a bigger impact. You can make quite a big impact on youth sports. And I wish more SSC and sports performance coaches would do that. And I think even if it's just having like a smaller group as a volunteer coach, or having one group somewhere where you really coach the younger kids, that's something I think I would like to see more, because it's quite interesting that everyone thinks it's so nice and so cool, but nobody really wants to do it. Yeah, I wish more coaches would spend time with coaching younger athletes. I do that also just like as a part-time and I work in I make my money in pro sports or in elite sports, and not with coaching kids. But I always found that that's actually how you make change in the system, by coaching kids.
I love that. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. And as I said, I have a strength training for kids online course that I've done particularly for youth coaches that want to start resistance training with kids, then don't really know how to start it. So if someone wants to do a project and said, okay, I'm going to start now resistance or strength trainings or athletic development session for kids once or twice a week, then I try to help coaches to set it up and share a bit how I did it. Yeah, that's it. And I think you find it on my website.
Yeah. Would you tell people where they can find you?
So I have a website. It's eoperformance.com. Same name for Twitter and same name for Instagram. So I try to keep it simple. I usually reply to messages on Instagram or on Twitter. Sometimes it takes a few days, but usually if people have questions or send me an email, that's also fine.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a reminder that you can find further podcast episodes at www.siobhan-milner.com/podcast. And this is where you can also find different ways of working with me if you head to www.siobhan-milner.com. Enjoy.